Moscow, 1945. The war in Europe is finally over, and a delegation of Soviet schoolchildren, neat little uniforms, rehearsed smiles, presents a gift to the American ambassador, ally to ally, a thank you. It's a plaque, the Great Seal of the United States, the eagle and the shield and the arrows, hand-carved from wood, and it is beautiful. The ambassador is touched. He carries it home to Spaso House, his official residence, and hangs it on the wall of his private study, right behind his desk. And for the next 7 years, whenever the other side chooses to listen, every word spoken in that room walks straight out of the building. No wire runs from that seal. No battery sits inside it. Nothing to power, nothing to trace, nothing to switch off. And that is exactly why nobody finds it. It takes the United States 7 years to answer a single question. And the answer rewrites what a listening device even is. So, how do you build a bug with nothing to find?
Welcome to From Smoke to Signal. I'm Mo, and my co-host Smart Cat will take you on a journey where every signal has a story. Let's begin.
Wait. No wire, no battery, no power. Then how exactly did a wooden eagle hear anything? Because from where I'm sitting, that is a rock with a bird on it.
If you were here last time, I promised you this one. The Americans who eventually found it called it the thing, because they didn't have a better word for what they were looking at. It hung in the study of Ambassador Avril Harriman and later his successors at Spaso House, the American ambassador's residence in Moscow, and it may be the most elegant piece of espionage hardware of the 20th century. Not for what it did, for what it didn't need. No battery, no wires, no power source of any kind. Everything a bug sweep is built to detect, this thing simply didn't have, which makes the lesson bigger than one seal on one wall. A signal doesn't need a power source to betray you.
Okay, but no power isn't clever. It's broken. A microphone with no power is a paperweight. You're telling me the paperweight won a piece of the Cold War?
To see how the paperweight works, you have to meet the man who designed it. He was a genuine genius. He was also, at the time, a prisoner of the same government he was building it for. His name is Léon Theremin, the man who invented the Theremin, that eerie instrument you play without ever touching it, just waving your hands through the air. Born in St. Petersburg in 1896, and by the late 1920s, this Soviet engineer isn't just an inventor anymore in New York, he's a genuine celebrity. In 1929, RCA, yes, that RCA, licenses his design and starts selling it as a mass market instrument. A year earlier, he'd already headlined his own Music from the Ether concert at Carnegie Hall and reportedly played for Rachmaninoff and Toscanini besides. This isn't a footnote in tech history. This is a Broadway-level act. He opens his own music studio and lab in Manhattan, a salon for the era's biggest names. His star student is a young violinist, Clara Rockmore, who'd given up the violin after an injury and instead becomes the greatest thereminist who ever lived. For most of a decade, Theremin isn't hiding from anyone. He's the toast of New York. Then, in 1938, it all stops. Theremin vanishes from New York and turns up back in the Soviet Union, and why he went back is still argued about. Some accounts blame crushing debts, others say Moscow recalled him, others say Soviet agents walked him out of his own studio. Whichever version is true, the celebrity chapter of his life ends the day he leaves New York.
Hang on. Carnegie Hall, Rachmaninoff, his own studio, 1 year. His Soviet freighter home to a purge the next. That is not a career change. That is whiplash with a passport.
Within months, he's swept up in Stalin's Great Purge, arrested and shipped east toward Kolyma, some of the deadliest gold mining camps in the entire Gulag system. Whatever fame meant in New York, it means nothing here. He survives only because Soviet intelligence eventually pulls him back out, not to freedom, but into a Sharashka, a secret prison design bureau. And here's the part people get wrong. They picture a free Soviet genius happily building weapons for the motherland. Not close. Theremin designs the thing behind bars, one prisoner engineer among several, building technology for the state that jailed him. In 1947, that same government hands him a Stalin Prize for his work in the bureau. Sit with that for a second because it's the part that doesn't square. 1947, the same year the Soviet state hands him a Stalin Prize, one of its highest honors, for the very device you just heard about. Theremin builds it as a prisoner, not an engineer who volunteered to help the state, but a man convicted and sentenced by that same government, the one that had shipped him toward the gold mines of Kolyma less than a decade before. Life inside a Sharashka was nothing like Kolyma. Prisoners here were fed, housed, and put back to work at a bench instead of a mine, by most accounts. But fall out of favor, and the train back to Siberia was always waiting. As the story is usually told, it's that very 1947 prize that finally buys him his way out. The reward and the release landing together the same year. The system never saw any of that as a contradiction to hide. It was the whole design. Keep the country's most valuable minds alive and working. Because the state needed what was in their heads more than it needed to keep punishing them. And Theremin was only one name on that roster. By several accounts, that very same system, that very same year, was also funneling in a young war veteran named Alexander Solzhenitsyn into a bureau known as Marfino, where, fittingly, the assigned work was also about listening, analyzing recorded voices to help track down a leak. Solzhenitsyn turned those years into the novel The First Circle, and it remains the closest thing the outside world has to a window into what building something like The Thing from inside a cell must have actually felt like. There's no villain anywhere in this story, just a state that had learned to point its most brilliant prisoners at a problem instead of a firing squad.
Wait, they throw him in a death camp, and years later they're pinning a state prize on him for the bunk he built. In prison. Oh, that's not a reward. That's a leash with a ribbon on it.
The Thing wasn't his last piece of tradecraft. In that same Sharashka, he built a second system, Burin, bouncing a low-power infrared beam off a window pane to read speech vibrations straight through the glass, aimed at the American, British, and French embassies alike. Whether that Stalin prize was really for the seal or for Burin, historians still argue both ways. After that, he mostly disappears, not executed, not free, just filed away, working in quiet obscurity for decades while the West assumed he died years earlier. Only in 1991, as the Soviet Union itself was collapsing, did Leon Theremin finally return to America, 95 years old, reunited with Clara Rockmore. He died in Moscow 2 years later at 97. So put yourself in 1945, you want to bug a room. Every listening device on Earth has the same fatal flaw. To get sound out of that room, it needs power, and power gives you away. A battery, it dies. So someone changes it or finds it. A wire to the wall, a sweep team traces it, an active transmitter broadcasting on its own. That's the easiest of all to catch, that you just listen for the broadcast and walk to the source. Every bug in history had a heartbeat, and a heartbeat can be found. So the real problem was never hearing the room. It was getting the sound out without leaving a single trace to follow.
So, no battery, no wire, no transmitter, no heartbeat. Then let me ask it plainer than the ambassador did. How the hell did the dead thing on the wall hear anything?
Here's the trick, and it's gorgeous. Inside the seal, Theremin put no electronics at all, just a small silver-plated chamber in a resonant cavity, sealed on one side by a membrane so thin it's measured in microns, thinner than a sheet of paper. Behind the membrane, a little tuning post, sticking out an antenna about 9 inches long. That is the entire device. On its own, it does absolutely nothing. It's inert, dead metal, until, from a building across the street, the Soviets aim a radio beam at it, the beam floods the cavity with energy and it wakes up. Now, when someone speaks in that study, the sound waves push on that paper-thin membrane. The membrane flexes a fraction of a hair in time with the voice, and that tiny flexing changes how the cavity throws the beam back. It stamps the sound of the room onto the reflected signal. Across the street, the Soviets just listen to the reflection.
So, they never powered the bug at all. They powered it from outside, whenever they felt like it. It's not a microphone. It's a mirror. A mirror for sound.
A mirror for sound. That's exactly it. And that's the whole genius. When the beam is off, there is nothing there. No emission, no current, no signal. A bug sweep walks right past a solid lump of metal because that is all it is. The device only exists electrically in the moments the other side chooses to switch it on. Whoever can illuminate on demand and stay dark the rest of the time wins. As for the exact frequency they beamed at it, honestly, the sources still argue. You'll see figures cited from around 330 megahertz all the way up to about 1700. The number is disputed. The principle is not. Let's slow this down because it's the part worth really understanding. Blow across the top of an empty bottle, soft or with some force. Within reason, it's the same note either time. The bottle's shape sets the pitch, not how hard you blow. That silver cavity inside the seal does the same trick with radio waves instead of air. It's built to ring cleanly at one particular pitch. When someone talks in the room, the voice doesn't reshape the cavity. It just wobbles that ring the same way an unsteady breath wobbles the bottle's note.
So, it's a wine glass. A wine glass that hums the same note every time. And snags whatever's said in the room. I will never trust stemware again.
That's also why the antenna's length isn't arbitrary. It's cut to match the beam meant to illuminate it, the way a whip antenna is sized for one radio band, not just any band. Get the length wrong and the reflection back is too faint to catch, no matter how good the receiver. Picture that membrane through something you may already own. A condenser microphone, the kind in a real recording studio, is also just a thin membrane sitting a hair's width from a metal plate. Moving air changes the tiny electrical capacitance between them, and a circuit reads it. The thing used that same capacitive trick, but read it with a reflected radio beam instead of a circuit. No power supply anywhere. And credit where it's due, Theremin didn't dream up the cavity itself. A resonant cavity microphone on that same principle had already been patented in America at RCA around 1941 by an engineer named Koch. Theremin's leap wasn't the cavity. It was cutting the wire, turning a microphone that still needed a plug into a mirror that needed nothing but a beam, aimed from a building across the street whenever the other side felt like listening. Before you decide the Americans in Moscow were careless, sit with this. They weren't. In the years before that seal ever came off the wall, security sweeps of the embassy and of Spaso House itself happened again and again, and by most accounts, those sweeps actually found something more than once. Sweep teams had pulled conventional microphones out of American buildings in Moscow before, one, the story goes, wired into a ventilator shaft above an ambassador's study, others simply hidden in the walls of the residence, as far back as the 1930s. This was not a posting nobody was watching. It may have been one of the most closely swept diplomatic addresses on the planet.
Hold on, they'd found real bugs before, more than once, and they still walked past this one for 7 straight years. Somebody owes that eagle an apology.
Here's the catch. Every one of those earlier finds had something to grab onto. A wire running down inside a wall, a battery that needed changing eventually, a live broadcast a receiver could tune into, hunt for a wire, a battery, or a transmission. That was the entire art of a sweep in this era, and it worked again and again. The ambassadors in between, men like Walter Bedell Smith, who held the post through the back half of the 40s, worked under the same standing assumption everyone in that building did, that in Moscow, the walls themselves were listening. By most accounts, the truly sensitive conversations moved outside, into the garden, onto a walk, or into whichever room the technicians had most recently cleared. So when this seal sat on that wall for 7 straight years and never once got caught, that wasn't the sweep teams failing at their job. Their doctrine was built correctly for a bug with a heartbeat, a wire, a battery, a broadcast. Nobody had built a doctrine yet for a bug with none of the 3. That gap is exactly what let it hide in plain sight. So how do you ever catch a bug that's invisible unless it's switched on? You get lucky. Around 1951, a British radio operator at their embassy in Moscow is turning a dial and stumbles onto something impossible. American voices, clear, casual, official, coming through on an open Soviet channel. He's overhearing the Americans on a Russian frequency, that's the beam, leaking, while it lit up the ambassador's study during a meeting. It didn't reveal the seal. It revealed that something in that building was talking to the Soviets. Now, the Americans knew a ghost was in the house. They just had to find a thing that most of the time wasn't there.
Right, because the second you go looking, the other side just turns off the flashlight, and your ghost evaporates. How do you find a bug that's only real when you're not looking for it?
The tip almost died on the vine. Through 1951 and into 1952, security men swept Spaso House again and again and came up empty. One pass even ran a metal detector over the carved seal itself. Negative. They found nothing for a simple reason nobody in the room understood yet. The beam was off. A dead resonant cavity reads as a rock with a bird on it because electrically, that's all it is, until someone across the street switches it on.
So the world's most thorough security sweep correctly detected 0 electronics in a thing that at that exact moment had 0 electronics running. That's not a failed inspection. That's the trap working exactly as designed.
So in September of 1952, a State Department security team, the technician Joseph Bezyan, among them, tries something new. By most accounts, Bezyan doesn't walk in with a case of instruments. He moves into Spaso House as a house guest. For days, dinners, bridge in the evening, watching the rhythm of the place. His equipment ships in separately out of Soviet sight. Then the bait, Ambassador George Kennan sits at that desk with his secretary and reads an old dispatch aloud, slow and deliberate. Somewhere in the house, Bezyan walks the halls with a receiver, listening for one thing. Kennan's own voice coming back at him on a frequency it has no business being on. It happens. The dictation returns, faint and secondhand, and Bezyan follows it like a scent, straight to the wall behind the desk. As the security men later told it, Bezyan went at the wall first, hammer in hand. The signal cut dead, wrong target. So he turned to the seal itself and, by their account, hacked into the carved wood until the eagle gave up what was inside: the chamber, the paper-thin membrane, the antenna. 7 years undone in minutes. The story goes Bezdian trusted the find to no one, not even the embassy safe. That night, he's said to have slept with it under his own pillow. The next day, it flew to Washington.
A grown man slept on top of Soviet spy hardware to keep it safe. I sleep on top of the remote so nobody touches the channel. Bezdian, I see you.
Kennan wrote about it years later in his own memoirs, and what stayed with him wasn't the gadget, it was performing for a listener he couldn't see. He described the atmosphere in that room as almost impossible to convey, an unseen third presence, so vivid he half expected to hear it breathing, a diplomat alone at his desk playing to an audience of one invisible man across the street. When the device reached Washington, the reaction was all first. The FBI, the CIA, the Navy's own lab, even British engineers stunned that anyone had built this with no power source at all. Then the awe curdled colder. If this hung in an ambassador study for 7 years past a metal detector, past 2 prior sweeps, what else in how many other rooms had they never found at all? Now one contested piece, because I want to be straight with you about what's solid and what isn't. For decades, the popular story was that British intelligence cracked it first, that MI5's Peter Wright built a working copy, codenamed Satyr. Let's steelman it. Wright was a real MI5 scientist. Marconi engineers genuinely were involved. It's a great yarn. But here's the honest caveat. That version rests almost entirely on one source, Wright's own memoir, Spycatcher. No copy of Satyr survives. No photo of it exists. And Wright is a badly discredited narrator. Even the CIA called his book full of errors and self-inflation. The better documented Western copy wasn't even British. It was an American and Dutch effort. So yes, someone reverse engineered the thing. Just don't let anyone tell you with a straight face exactly who got there first. Here's the part that's bolted down by paper, not memoir. Once the FBI finished picking apart the thing, in December of 1952, the CIA opened its own file, a program to copy the ghost. Washington needed a lab that actually worked at these frequencies. It turned first to the Dutch Security Service, the BVD, run by Louis Einthoven. And by 1954, Einthoven had steered the Americans toward a small outfit on the Dutch coast, the Netherlands Radar Proof Station, the Dutch Radar Laboratory in the seaside town of Noordwijk. By 1955, the CIA had handed the lab's founder, Joop van Dyke, an actual replica of the thing and asked him to build it again. By most accounts, matching Theremin's paper-thin membrane to that same precision proved brutal. The Dutch team couldn't get a reliable copy of the cavity itself, so they built something related instead. Their own passive trick, a diode and a tiny microphone amplifier, dead metal, until an outside beam woke it up. The CIA called the program Easy Chair. The first working set shipped in 1956. A second mark followed, then a third, a fourth, a fifth.
Every government on Earth stood up and called this thing an outrageous violation of diplomatic trust. And every government on Earth immediately ordered one for itself. Bugs really do make strange bedfellows.
And that's the point we're sitting with. The West never just wanted to catch this trick, and it wanted to own it. Easy Chair's real assignment was planting a battery-free listener of its own inside the Soviet ambassador's office in The Hague, and reportedly the Chinese embassy there too. A decade later, in 1965, the Dutch lab finally cracked a working version of Theremin's own cavity trick. By then, the CIA had already moved on to other methods, but the principle had already crossed sides for good. The most damning bug of the Cold War didn't just get discovered, it got recruited. And the Americans, they kept the whole thing secret for 8 more years. Then, May 26, 1960, it becomes the perfect weapon in a completely different fight. Weeks earlier, the Soviets had shot down an American U-2 spy plane and captured its pilot, Gary Powers, and they had dragged the United States in front of the United Nations Security Council to be shamed for spying. So the U.S. ambassador to the UN, Henry Cabot Lodge Jr., walks into that chamber and holds up the carved wooden seal, open, the little device exposed inside the eagle, and says, in effect, you want to talk about spying? This hung in our ambassador's home in Moscow for 7 years. The bug that had been America's quiet humiliation became, in a single afternoon, America's evidence.
So the eagle spent 7 years as a wall decoration, and about one afternoon as the greatest microphone drop in Cold War history. From gift to gotcha, the I respect it.
And here's what the thing really proved, the part everyone remembers wrong. The marvel was never that it was clever, it's that it was patient. A device with no power was the most durable bug ever built, precisely because there was nothing running to detect. The side that could illuminate on demand and stay silent the rest of the time held every card. That idea did not die in 1952. It went to work. Fast forward to 1984. After a tip that an Allied embassy's own cipher equipment had turned up compromised, technicians in Washington start X-raying typewriters just shipped back from the embassy in Moscow and the consulate in Leningrad. And inside an ordinary IBM Selectric standard office equipment across America at the time, they find something that has no business being there. By the time the sweep is done, it isn't one typewriter. It's 16, quietly compromised since 1976, some of them for 8 years. The operation to run this down gets a name, Project Gunman. And what they find inside is almost a compliment. Hidden in a hollowed-out aluminum support bar, an ordinary structural piece running the width of the machine, Soviet engineers had packed in magnetometers and a tiny transmitter, then swapped in typewriter parts fitted with hidden magnets. Every keystroke swung one of those magnetized parts past the sensors inside that bar, turning the mechanical rhythm of typing itself into data. No microphone required. The device stored a run of keystrokes, then fired them out in one short burst, tucked into the same radio band as the local television station, so it read as static to anyone not looking for it. It's the Great Seal's whole philosophy matured for the electronic age.
So last time, they bugged a wooden bird. This time, they bugged the office equipment everyone touches 8 hours a day. Somebody in Moscow got a promotion for that upgrade.
And it wasn't only typewriters. Through the 1980s, the U.S. was building an entirely new embassy compound in Moscow, built, as always, with Soviet-supplied labor and materials. By the mid-80s, American security teams inspecting the site were finding listening devices poured directly into the precast concrete panels, mixed in with decoy metal and other junk meant to make the real bugs harder to find. The building was so compromised that Congress spent years debating whether to tear the whole thing down and start over. In the end, they didn't raise all of it, but the building's upper floors were ultimately torn off and rebuilt, this time with American crews finishing the job.
So the walls were the bug. At this point, just assume the doorknobs are filing reports too.
Added up and the picture gets bigger than one seal on one wall, a carved eagle in 1945, a typewriter's support bar in 1976, a concrete wall in the 1980s, 3 different decades, 3 completely different objects, and the same idea running underneath all of it. Hide inside something the other side already trusts and only switch on when you have to. The Great Seal wasn't a single clever trick. It was the opening move in a 40-year game played out inside walls, gifts, and office equipment. Here's what direct ancestor actually has to earn, not just claim. This idea has real dated relatives years apart that never once talked to each other. Start with a sibling. By the end of the Battle of Britain, the Royal Air Force is fitting its fighters with a small unit that hears the ground radar beam sweep past and answers automatically, operating a signal that reads, "Friendly, don't fire." They call it identification, friend, or foe. Same basic move as the SEAL. Something answers a beam it never asked for. But that IFF set carries its own transmitter, its own battery. It shouts back under its own power. The SEAL never had that luxury.
So the Cold War's masterpiece still needed someone to invent answer with no battery. Somebody radio that memo to the fighter planes.
That memo, it turns out, got written the same year the SEAL Harriman had hung was still hanging silently in that Moscow study. Years before anyone in Washington knew it existed. In 1948, a radio engineer named Harry Stockman, doing military radio research in Massachusetts, publishes a paper in the Proceedings of the Institute of Radio Engineers called Communication by Means of Reflected Power. Working in the open literature with zero knowledge the thing existed, he lays out the same core physics Theremin had already built in secret, a target with no power of its own, answering by changing what it reflects. Parallel minds, one classified, one public, same year, neither aware of the other. The idea sits in the open literature for 2 more decades before anyone turns it into a product. In 1970, engineer Mario Cardullo files a patent that goes one step past Stockman's paper, using that same beamed energy to run a chip with real memory and answering back with actual data. It's granted in January of 1973. That patent is the literal on-paper ancestor of the tag in your pocket right now. Because that exact physics in a tag with no battery, woken up by a beam from outside, answering by changing what it reflects back, is now the most ordinary thing you own. It's in your passport, it's the tap-to-pay chip in your credit card, the NFC in your phone, the toll transponder on your windshield, the anti-theft tag sewn into a jacket, the little sticker on a library book. Every one of them is dead until a reader lights it up. and then it talks back by modulating the reflection. That is not a metaphor for the thing. It's Stockman's paper and Cardullo's patent soldered into a product line. The single most sophisticated bug of the Cold War became the reason you can wave your wallet at a turnstile. The thing built to steal words out of a room is now how you buy coffee.
Let me make sure I've got the ARC. Soviet superweapon hidden in a gift. Spies on America for 7 years. And its grandkids now live in my bus pass. Same trick. Nobody's spying, I'm just tapping in.
The spy world never let that idea go. It just kept shrinking it. In 2013, a catalog of American intelligence hardware leaked to the public. A whole family of passive, battery-free retro reflectors, dead metal until somebody lights them up. One, Ragemaster, hides in the ferret bead on an ordinary monitor cable and reflects back the screen when a radar beam finds it. The agency's own cost sheet lists it at about $30. And hobbyists calling themselves the NSA Playset have since rebuilt gadgets from that same catalog for as little as $50 in parts. Theremin's physics is no longer a nation-state secret.
Great. So the little bump on my monitor cable might be a spy, and I've been resting my coffee mug on it. Cool.
There's a cousin to this that skips the implant completely. Bounce light off a window pane from outside, and the glass itself vibrates with the voices in the room. Read that vibration, and you're listening without ever leaving hardware behind. The idea is usually traced back to Theremin, too, from around those same years. I'll keep this one historical. How it's used today, I won't spell out.
So nothing with a reflection is safe. Got it. I'm never opening the blinds again.
Which is why defense finally started fighting the same way. Bug sweepers now carry a nonlinear junction detector, flood a wall or a phone with radio energy, and any hidden circuit trying to hide inside answers back with a signature no natural material makes. It wasn't born as spy gear. It started out hunting corrosion under aircraft paint. But by the early 70s, it had been repurposed for exactly this, finding a bug that's dead until somebody shines a light on it. So, who owns the air in the room you're standing in right now? Whoever can quietly illuminate it and stay dark the rest of the time. A signal doesn't need a power source to betray you. It just needs someone patient enough to wait.
Fine. The careful human won't say it, so the cat will. Mark it. By 2028, that battery-free trick gets its own named line on the official supply chain threat lists. That's my call, not his. If 2028 shows up and I'm wrong, you know exactly which mammal to blame, and people say I am the one who stares at nothing.
Every signal has a story. If you want more of these, the hidden history buried inside the technology you use every single day, subscribe because that's the whole journey. 1 episodes early, plus a few things the public never sees. Join the Smoke Signal Society, link below. And if you work in this world for real and need spectrum or regulatory help, there's a separate link for that. Next time, how did the wireless standard connecting your headphones right now get named after a Viking king who's been dead for 1,000 years? The answer is carved into a stone in Denmark. And yes, that's where the little Bluetooth symbol comes from too. See you then, from smoke to signal.
That's another signal pulled out of the noise. We're tracing the whole history of the airwaves, right up to the fight happening now. Subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.